Well, this is the New Revised Standard Version, which is kind of my go-to translation of Genesis chapter 11. So we're going to read just a few verses, then Lucas and I are going to interact with them. And there are a lot of different ways that you can go with the Tower of Babel. Lucas is being trained to see some of the humor in it, and I'm hoping that you'll pull that out, Lucas, because that's probably stuff people don't generally see. It's not easy to laugh when reading. I don't know why. It doesn't feel like a text you should laugh at. But there are definitely books that are more sarcastic than others, and this may be one of those passages. 2 Corinthians, for instance, Paul seems to have a lot of sarcastic things to say about the Corinthians, so it's not unusual. But here we are in Genesis chapter 11. I'm just going to read the beginning of this, the opening of it, and it's helpful to know that in chapter 10, we've just been listed out all of the descendants of Noah through his 3 sons and the different places that they have landed. And now we get, and it's all in cities around the Middle East. And now we have the Tower of Babel story. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So let's stop with that. I mean, that's probably enough to give us some historical context. So Lucas, help the folks out. You just did this research. Where is this generally considered to be? And what do you make of that first verse?
Yeah, so the first verse there, there's one language and the same words. Some other ways to look at it are like one tongue and maybe even few words. Like kind of like you were talking about, like with the comedic aspect, it could be a little poke at like how intelligent the people were with like the few words. There's just that they didn't have a huge vocabulary. It seems to be implied in that first verse there.
Yeah, remember this is written by the people of Israel, traditionally Moses, and they're very familiar with the various nations that have inhabited the plain of Shinar. So when you did your study, what's the low-hanging fruit? Who inhabits the plain of Shinar?
Yeah, I mean, they're in Mesopotamia. And that would be originally where Babylon would have started. In Shinar.
So Babylon is one of the lowest hanging fruits, right? This is
right.
So for the Israelites to want to make fun of the Babylonians, especially since they eventually end up in exile, that would make some sense.
Yeah, for sure. And also a lot of the people that in this area that we talked about in chapter 10 are in Shinar as well. I mean, Shinar is not super specific, just the plain area.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of cities that are close by.
Yeah, and Babylon's not the first city to inhabit this region. I mean, the Persians ruled this area prior, though this was not where their capital city would have been. They had several capitals, Nineveh being the most famous, which is a little further north. But also the Sumerian Empire is here. In fact, the city of Ur, where Abraham's called from, is very close to this region as well. So this is a place that has been settled several times. Babylon maybe being, today, this is where Iraq is at least traditionally this area. Yeah. So there's been a lot of resettlement here over many years. Yeah. So one language, the Hebrew word there for language is the word safa, which means speech. It also means lip. So
I think I said tongue. I should have said lip.
Yeah, one lip and the same davar is the Hebrew word, the same words. Very, very common word for not speaking, but for the content of speech, for the things that are said. So one of the ways this can be read, and I tend to read it this way in 11:1, is that they all thought the same way. So they're of one way of thinking.
They all agree.
Yeah, I think that's essentially it. It doesn't have to mean they all speak the exact same literal language, though I think the story plays out that might in fact be the case. But this first verse is indicating they share a worldview. That's more like what we would say, right? Like it's contemporary today to say people of European descent are all the same. Right? I know that's very offensive to all of us, but the sense there is we have very many different languages in Europe, right? and different governmental structures and different kind of food and cuisine and cultural expressions. But there is kind of this Enlightenment ethos, very scientist, very humanist, very secular, that is shared by the vast majority of Europeans. So you might even say that Europe is of one lip and the same devar, or devarim would be the word. You might say that because there's a kind of a Western worldview. And that's probably what's in play here. They all think the same. They have the same devarim. I like that they all have one lip. It's kind of like saying they all have one mouth. And, cultures can be this way. There was a long time in America that all Americans were lumped into the same. Of course, people are resistant to that today. I remember I was raised. Were you raised with this, Lucas? The idea that America was a melting pot?
Yes.
But what were you taught? Because you wouldn't have been taught that, right?
I mean, we
use
definitely
a melting pot?
When I grew up, they talked about like the melting pot and like all these different ethnic groups coming to America and forming like a joint new culture, I suppose.
Okay. So that wasn't criticized in your education?
Not in the younger years. I mean, as I got later, they just stopped talking about it.
Uh-huh.
But I'm definitely familiar with like the melting pot.
See, I'm a Gen Xer.
When I was young.
Yeah, I'm a Gen Xer, so we were in that transitional phase where they tried to fix the old forms before they just tossed them. So I was raised as a kid to say America was a melting pot. Everybody comes from the different places, but they all blend into the same dish, and each one contributes something to it. But in the end, it creates a new culture. But by the time I was in college, they started talking about us like a salad. Where we kind of form the same dish, but everybody keeps their distinctive flavors, And I guess by the time you came up, they just didn't even talk about it anymore.
No, I definitely was never taught that America was like a salad.
That would have been like my early college. I remember freshman seminar. This would have been 1995. No, 4. Like
they must have went with different metaphors because I'm definitely familiar with the melting pot, but they didn't like elaborate very much like how it works out as far as within the food metaphor.
Yeah, in the 80s when I was coming up, there's this huge push to think of American culture as opposed to like communist culture, like the Soviet Union, and so this kind of America as a uniform ideology was pretty strong. But after the fall of the Soviet Union and the 90s, that starts to break up, and we started to celebrate that America was actually made up of many different cultures, and each culture remained distinctive within the American. That became a 90s sort of way of talking about it, very postmodern. And so that's where the salad thing came. It didn't stick, obviously. Maybe they only said that at Gordon. I don't know. But anyway, the Babel is being presented as very monolithic, very melting pot-ish. There are a lot of different families represented, but they all kind of have the same lip and the same words. They have the same mouth and the same basic content.
Yeah, people are definitely being lumped together.
Yeah.
Into one like ideology, one train of thought, and one community. And
I think it's possible what you're saying is possible, that the way that this is presented also indicates a very limited way of thinking. That might be making fun of it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess what I was talking about more that they literally had a weak vocabulary. Maybe
I took that metaphorically. If you meant it literally, I guess.
Maybe it is just like saying like you are that they don't have a very broad view of how things really could be, or they're narrow-minded people.
Yeah, simplistic. Yeah, and they migrate from the east. That's interesting, right?
It is interesting. They're coming from the east, and
because what's east of Shinar?
I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, it's like India. Like you're heading to Pakistan, India.
Yeah, like
nowadays.
Right. I suppose you would have assumed that they're coming more from the west, closer to other areas of Middle
Africa, that's where Egypt was. I mean, the big civilizations are more that direction. So you would have thought. But the interesting thing about the word Kedem, which is the word for east, is that it also can be used for ancient history. And some of that for Hebrew might be because Abraham comes from the east. And so the east has this sense of origins. And you'll remember that when Adam and Eve are thrown out of the garden, they're thrown east.
Right.
And so there's also kind of a picture that they thought of themselves as coming back to the Garden of Eden in Shinar, that they're establishing something. So they're coming from the east. So it may not be literal. That's my point. This idea of coming from the east might be metaphorical. It's very hard to say. But east, west, north, south, they tend to carry they're literally compass points, but they also tend to carry some weight metaphorically in Hebrew. So you're never quite sure what's at stake. So anyway.
Yeah, I think we have there with the Garden of Eden, like maybe they're hoping to like recreate that kind of experience.
Yeah.
As part of the community they're trying to create, like the wonderful Eden.
Yeah, and they stumble across this plain in Shinar, which in the days of like Israel's captivity in Babylon would have been a really impressive place. When you read the historical study of Babylon and what it looked like, I mean, they had one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was there, right? The hanging gardens of Babylon. Really difficult to imagine today because the place is like all mud. So I don't know. There's probably a whole history of ecological stuff that's occurred in what was called the Fertile Crescent and is now like not that. But anyway, it was a pretty nice place when they found it. What did your history tell you? The next verse says, and they came to one another, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. I mean, what did you discover? And is this the way that people generally built in this region, or is this sound unusual?
No, yeah, they're definitely trying to like compare Israelite way of doing things and the way that either the Babylonians or other people in this area would do things. So like, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. I think it actually says, let us brick bricks and burn for burning or something kind of ridiculous.
But that I wouldn't be surprised. The Hebrew there is lavain, to make something white. So let us make bricks white. But the word for white is the same root as the word for brick. And that's probably what your
right.
History was telling.
Kind of goes back to the few words, maybe kind of deal.
Yeah,
but
bricks.
Either way.
And burn them. What did you do any study on this to know whether this is a common way? I mean, we remember the story of the Israelites in Egypt. They were making bricks kind of like this, but they were at least using straw. Like this is just mud, right?
Well, I don't think that they're making fun of their method necessarily. It's like I think they had clay there, like the soil that they had. You had to burn it to make bricks in order to build things.
Yeah.
But the Israelites, they had stone where they were.
Right.
So in that comparison, like they say they make bricks and burn them thoroughly, and for brick they had stone. So they're just kind of comparing. They're telling people what they had there. They were a different people than like the Jews.
Right.
And instead of stone, like it's kind of like a hubris kind of deal here too. Like, oh, we the Israelites, we have stone, which we don't have to burn, we don't have to prepare the same way.
Yeah.
And like, but they used bricks and they had to burn them, and like the bitumen for mortar, same kind of deal. Like they didn't have the same tools and resources.
Right. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at. This is a very common way to build small structures. And you could build somewhat large structures with it. You and I, before we started recording, you talked about a ziggurat, which is a pretty common in this part of the world, especially like the Sumerian Empire, which is several generations, quite a number of generations before the Babylonians and before the Assyrians and before even the Hittites, who ruled this region during the days of Moses. It would have been the Hittites. But the Sumerians built ziggurats, and you can build them pretty big, but you're not going to reach heaven with them with a ziggurat, right?
I mean, I don't think no matter what building materials you have, you'll reach heaven, even though like heaven's kind of all around us. So
yeah, well, yeah, and in this ancient world, they're not going to think of the heavens like outer space. They're not thinking about aliens. They're just thinking about, cloud level.
Right, but yeah, they're certainly not going to be able to create a structure to get to God. I mean, if in fact they were building a ziggurat, like a lot of people think would make sense.
In this region, the biggest ziggurat is a very specific structure. It's not a pyramid. It's a very specific structure, but it's built on the same principle as a pyramid. Kind of a very wide base that narrows as you go up. So its height is dependent on the width of its base. And so the largest buildings in history built in that way are the pyramids in Egypt, right? They're trying to do something like that.
Right, and the ziggurats are smaller generally than pyramids, but I mean, there's pyramids of different sizes. They're smaller than the Great Pyramids.
Well, you've already pointed out one of the reasons. I mean, the pyramids are built out of rock.
Right, yeah, but it's taken a lot longer. They had to do a lot more work to build.
Yeah, and you have to worry about the height. So this is for the kind of project they want to accomplish. This would seem like not good material. For what, but it's normal material. It's absolutely what we see all through this region. Yeah,
I mean, definitely, it's not optimal, but that's what
you can get pretty big. I was watching a History Channel discovery of the ruins of an ancient ziggurat that looks like it would have been huge. So they're pretty big.
They were definitely very large. I mean,
and you had indicated, so they want to build this tower, which I think most historians agree was probably ziggurat-like, and they want to reach the heavens. Now, you had mentioned to me in conversation, and I think this is true throughout the history of the Middle East. What were ziggurats actually built for?
Yeah, so a ziggurat, each individual one would have been built for a specific god that these people were worshiping, and they were a stairway, more like a convenience. They would build for their specific god, for them to ascend and descend from the heavens. And there would have been a temple at the base of the ziggurat. They would have done sacrifices and offerings and things like that. And the top was kind of like a resting place for the long journey that the gods would have had. But they built them for gods to come up and down, not for them to reach the heavens and storm it or anything like that.
Well, yeah, and let me share my screen because I want you to continue on that line of thought. So then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. So this would have meant in the clouds.
Right.
That's what they would have been aiming for, or really high anyway. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we'll be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. The Lord came down to see the city. So what do you think what would you say their goal is? What are they actually trying to do?
I mean, they're trying to, I guess, be honoring to the gods that they think are in charge of the world, and maybe they're the people that created them, or however that works. But it's a structure for worship. And
and are they going to make a name for themselves by? How do you read it? I mean, one of the more compelling readings, in my view, you can just respond to this, is that they're not actually trying to themselves get to the heavens, but instead they're trying to make the tallest tower around so that the gods are most likely to come to this tower and therefore make this the capital city. How do you read it?
Yeah, I mean, the tower really is kind of like an afterthought. I mean, they build the city first, and there is a tower with the top in its heavens. So the tower isn't like the only and most important thing, for sure, which I think maybe needs to be mentioned just because we always think of this as the Tower of Babel. Even the NRSV puts the title as the Tower of Babel, which is not originally from the Bible, just to encourage people because they like to talk about the tower here.
Right, but it's the project is an entire city.
Right, but the city is what is most important, and then the tower gives us some extra things to talk about. But yeah, they're building it. They want to build something that's great and magnificent and that's notable.
And
So they want to make
they
a name
have
for
to
them.
have a God's blessing. That's the ancient culture. God has to affirm the city. They need the God to visit. And so they make a house for him. This is not that different than David wanting to build the temple in Jerusalem. He wanted the abode of God to be in his capital city. And he has some difficulty getting it there because when they first bring the Ark of the Covenant, there's an accident on the way. And so David is afraid to bring God into the city and leaves him outside for a while. But it's the same impulse. They want, in this case, I'm saying the gods. They might have only believed in one God. But all the cultures we're talking about, from the Sumerians on, they all are polytheists. So I'm assuming that they believe in multiple gods, but maybe they don't at this point. This is very early on. It's not, I mean, it's a number of generations from Noah, but not that far from him. So perhaps they're thinking of one God, but they're trying to make, I think, the most significant city in the ancient world. And in order to do that, the God would have to bless it. And so they're trying to make sure that they have an impressive enough tower that God is going to want to come there. I think that's what's at stake. And funny enough, if I'm right about that, it works. Like the Lord comes down to see the city. And the way the story is narrated, it's kind of like he comes down on the tower. So, and he checks it out. But he's not pleased. So I'll read this, and I'm curious how you read it, what you think the author of Genesis is doing here. And the Lord said, so he comes down. This is, I don't know if I'm right about this, Lucas, and you can disagree, but I get the sense from the text that they finished the project. And the Lord said, look, they're one people. They all have one language. Is this still the word lip? Yeah.
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah, it is. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do now will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there. Again, lip. So they will not understand one another's speech. I'm going to have to double check that. That can't be right. I looked up the Hebrew. That doesn't look right. I'm going to open up the actual Hebrew Bible in a moment so I can check it out. But because sometimes Logos doesn't parse things right. But I'll tell you what that word for speech is. I don't like what I just saw. It was the word ish. That's confusing to me. That's the word for man. So I got to look. I'll look that up. But anyway, what is God's problem with what they did? He clearly disapproves. I mean, does he clearly disapprove? How do you read this?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the biggest debates really within this passage is like, did they sin? Like, what actually went wrong with everything that happened here? Because until verse 6, like, it doesn't seem like they did anything that was really overtly wrong. We didn't really talk about them settling too much. We talked about like the area that they're settling. We didn't talk about exactly the settling itself, which there's definitely some discussion about maybe they shouldn't have settled at all, given like the command for the people to fill the earth and things like that.
Yeah, I didn't look at what that word, yeshav, is the word. Yeah, my instinct would say that word refers to a place where you're going to stay. That this is anyway.
In verse 6, clearly.
Well, talk a little more about that. What would be the problem with settling up to this point in Genesis?
Yeah, so I mean, God commands people to fill the earth and subdue it. They're supposed to take care of the earth and the animals and plow the fields and things like that. And that's really the only command that's given. It's given again to Noah in chapter 9, and that's kind of like the last thing that we have from God as far as what people should be doing.
Yeah. A matter of fact, for the Jewish tradition, of the 613 commandments, in the scriptures. That's like number 2.
Right.
The first is be fruitful and multiply.
Right.
Second is
it's part of the
fill the
same
land.
Right. So you could argue it's important. And you have to question whether these people knew that was something that they should be doing.
Right. So, but interestingly, that might be behind this. I don't disagree with that. But what's expressed in the text is not that. Right? I mean, that's not specifically what God points out.
Right. That's right. So up until that point, that's the only thing that you could say that, like, they're doing something that's really wrong. After what we've said about the tower and them not being something that they're really trying to get to God or something like that, something that God wouldn't want them to do. Otherwise, he would have been there with them already. But yeah, in verse 6, the language is what is emphasized here. And it talks about that, like, nothing that they propose to do now will be impossible. Which kind of comes back to, like, the humorous notes maybe in this passage. Like, nothing will be impossible for them. They they built this structure out of bricks in the city and they're a people that maybe has a weak vocabulary. And, like, what is God really getting at? Like, is there anything really that God has to worry about? Like, nothing will be impossible for them. That's what is always an interesting thing. But,
yeah, I guess if you read this as God being afraid, then it would seem ridiculous. Like, why would the building of this city cause any threat to God?
Right.
And if we're right about ziggurats, which I think we are, it wasn't built to be a threat to him anyway.
Right. Yeah, definitely. It seems like if it were a ziggurat, it's not built to be a threat.
Yeah. I don't know what kind of tower in the ancient world would be built to be a threat. Like, even if you're talking pyramids in Egypt, those were not meant to threaten the heavens. So yeah, I agree. I don't tend to think, so try this on for size. Tell me what you think about this. I don't think that this part is meant to be sarcastic myself. Every ancient civilization in history that ended up conquering huge swaths of territory and people started by centralizing and unifying a group of people into one whole. So I tend to think of this as, Rome was a bunch of city-states. It was one city-state in Italy, and then it was several. And in order for the Romans to conquer everything, they had to get their own country in order. It's the same thing that happened for the English, for instance. The reason there were always these wars to conquer Ireland, to conquer Scotland, is because the idea was you had to unify your own local area before you could go out and conquer the rest. My sense here is, and Babylon was the same, Assyria was the same, all those nations begin, we talked about this before we started, as a small city-state that eventually unifies itself and then conquers. I'm wondering if the threat here is that, remember, they only have one lip and they have one devar. Is the danger here for God that this ethos now will conquer the earth because of their organization? I suspect that might be what's in play. I mean, I don't know how you respond to that.
I would agree. I mean, I think, like we were talking about, there were people that are in agreement. And you made a comment if they had finished building the tower or not. The NRSV says had built. I mean, I haven't looked at the Hebrew. Other translations do say we're building.
Yeah,
I haven't looked into that specifically. I don't know if that's really anything worth spending too much time on. But the city and tower were definitely, like, they had gone far enough that God came down to look at it. And he thinks that they've completed something that is notable.
Yeah.
Because of the comment he makes about things being, that nothing will be impossible for them.
So I'm looking this up. It's a call perfect. So in Hebrew, you only have two verb tenses. You have a completed action and you have an incomplete action. So oftentimes completed actions get associated with the past, incomplete with the present or the future, but not always. Like God will sometimes predict things that haven't happened yet, but he'll use the perfect because he's basically saying it's done, even though it hasn't happened. And you might talk about something in the past in the imperfect because at the time it's still ongoing, and not finished. But this is a perfect. So it's the NRSV is right, had built. It's a perfect, it's a completed action. So I don't see much justification for saying it was being built unless they think the context demands it. But it's not an imperfect, which would be the normal one you would use for something that was happening.
Right. So I guess the idea, a lot of people, I don't know, a lot of people that I had talked to previously had always kind of thought like God stopped them from building the city.
Yeah, that's the way I was raised to see it.
Emphasis. So like, they were building the tower that was going to get them to God or something. But God stopped them, and like they didn't make it, but they could have because God was worried.
Well, and this is where your historical study really helps to illuminate it, because if you're just reading this, you know nothing about the culture.
Right.
Who knows what's at stake? I mean,
right.
It does sound like
you would never be like, oh, they're building a ziggurat. I mean, you would never read this and immediately think they're building a ziggurat unless you were the people maybe that were in the city. Then you'd be like, oh yeah, we were building a ziggurat.
Right. Yeah. And even the word is more typical later in Hebrew. It's used for like watchtowers and things like that.
And I think it actually means stairway in some way.
I don't know. Maybe the word is migdal. I don't know a lot of the etymology of the word. My basic lexicon tells me that it means a tower or a watchtower. It's used often in vineyards and things like that. It's occasionally used euphemistically for the word breast. And it can sometimes be used to denote an elevated stage or a pulpit, or even a raised bed. So
I mean,
kind of
anything.
high place maybe. But there is, for instance, a watchtower near Bethlehem in the scriptures that's called Migdal Edev, which is a watchtower over flocks. So anyway, that's the word. So you're looking at it. Anybody in Israel reading that word, they might not have thought ziggurat either. They just something tall.
Right.
But because we know the region, and we know the kinds of towers that were built there and for what reason you built tall towers, I think it's pretty reasonable. And once you see that, you realize it's more likely they're trying to bring heaven down to them than that they are trying to get up to heaven. Right. And so, but I do think it was built. That's what got us into that. my sense is here, that's a call perfect. And the perfect tense typically is talking about something that's finished. I mean, it didn't have to be. I didn't look to see if it's got a vav on it because that changes things, but nobody cares about that. No, it does not have a vav on it. This is a completed action. I don't know how else you could argue anything else.
Yeah, there are several translations that'll use for building, but either way, yeah, it uses built here, and it seems like it's built enough. Either way, regardless whether it's.
I was raised the same way you did. I had an illustrated Bible as a kid, and I can still remember that they all left and it was only half completed and there were bricks everywhere.
Right, not stones, but
Bricks. So he decides to confuse their lips so they won't understand each other's, and I looked this up, Logos software is wrong. They won't understand each other's lips. So that's what he decides to do.
Right. So I guess we were talking, finishing up, like what's impossible for them, what that means. And you brought up like the ideology, I guess, of what they're going to do. And I agree, but I guess slightly different is like they have already started creating something that's just going to get them down the wrong path. Like from now on, it's only going to get worse. They're only going to just keep following their own way of doing things that is separate from God here, because God comes down and is immediately disappointed. Obviously, they're not, like God didn't ask them to build the city. It's not obvious that they're committing a sin yet, but they're certainly not doing anything that God is happy with.
Yeah, so and the fact that they have the same lip and the same devar meaning they're all thinking the same. If God is not pleased with this, that means that they're not, you're right. It implies that they're not actually listening to God. They're definitely not walking with him.
Right.
And that's dangerous, right?
Yeah. And like you were saying, as far as like, if you're thinking of like Rome, but if this were to be everybody and everyone has the same belief, then like, where are God's people going to be? It's just everybody all agrees, and it's going to spread.
Yeah. And in the ancient world, and we talked about how all is, technically is not always used literally, it can be used figuratively. But in the ancient world, they wouldn't have cared what any individual thought. Individualism is not very pronounced throughout most of history. Whatever the capital city did, whatever the king did, that's what everybody was going to do. You see that throughout. They don't have a lot of freedom to do otherwise. Like pretty much those in charge are going to lead the way. So if this city becomes the capital city, which it seems to me that that's their intent, then it doesn't really matter if people have other opinions in other places. Like, does it matter if people disagree with the Romans or the Babylonians? It doesn't really matter because they're going to conquer them. They're going to make them agree. So
Right.
that, I think that's the sense of this. If they can create a powerful enough starting point, everybody's going to end up going in their direction, whether they agree with it or not.
Right. And then looking at like where we are in the Bible, early in Genesis, where people keep turning back to being wicked and doing terrible things. God had to wipe people out with the flood already. And like here we are in chapter 11 again, and people are not obeying God.
Yeah.
They're just doing whatever they want, separate and
Yeah,
apart from him.
if God had a face, he'd be palming it, right?
I know. He's upset with the people again, but he's like, well, I told everyone I wasn't going to kill them again. So like,
well, and
what's going on here?
You can try this on for size. I'll say it because it is how I tend to read it, but I haven't found a lot of commentators that will go in the direction that I tend to go. I think, so before the flood, and Minister Joe and I spent a lot of time on this, the problem with the earth is it's somewhat divided. Like there's a lot of violence. And then God destroys the earth. There seems to be a sense that this might be a corrective measure, that they might think, the earth was just destroyed just a few generations ago because of all the violence. So maybe we just need to create kind of a monolithic culture. Maybe we need to have one strong central point and wipe out anybody who would disagree with us. My sense is that this is a corrective measure, that they kind of think that this is going to solve the problem. And the reason I think that is because this is still how we think we can solve the problem. A strong centralized government forcing everybody into some sort of alignment. This has been the solution throughout history. And even though we're a democracy, we're kind of seeing how being too much of a democracy creates issues. So this is a very human solution, maybe to the pre-flood dilemma. But God is not pleased with this solution. Like, this is not the right solution. And one thing they're missing that we see rarely evidenced in Genesis 1-11, but always highlighted when it is they're not walking with God. They're not talking with God. They're not receiving. God didn't command them to build this city. So there's some sort of a disconnect. And they're guessing. That's the way I read it. I'm not saying this authoritatively. You don't have to agree with it. But they're guessing at how to solve the problem. And they're guessing wrong. And something about the whole thing tells God that the earth's in a lot of trouble if he doesn't intervene. That's the way I kind of see it. But I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're half on the right track there.
Well, I'm better to be half than not at all.
I think that because like they're settling, and somehow we overlook completely the scattering aspect.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about that quite yet. But because they fear being scattered, like they want to make a name for themselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad.
That's absolutely right. And it's good to get back to that because the Lord uses...
Right, because then there's the scattering that comes up again for us. But it seems like they're definitely worried about something. It doesn't necessarily have to be that they're worried that God is going to perform some judgment on them again. It could just be other people that they're worried about.
Yeah.
Kind of like we're saying, if you get everybody together and we all agree, like then we don't have to worry about getting overthrown and losing what we have. There's like the safety and security aspect.
Try this on for size. So the word scattered is the word poots. And it's kind of the exile term. And the danger of exile is that you'll lose your identity, that you're just going to become one of just one of the
Right.
the
It'd
other
be like a
nations.
forgotten people, which would make sense given what we have in verse 4, is that the scattering that they were worried about comes right after, let us make a name for ourselves.
Yeah.
So, and like we were saying, like they built the city and the tower because they want to be remembered, they want to be notable, they want to do something that's significant. And they don't want to be scattered, they want to be left alone, people that are forgotten.
Right.
And it's kind of also notable in this passage, like nobody is named yet. They're just talked about generally. Like they're not given a name till the very end, which we haven't talked about yet. So
Yeah.
the name that they want to make for themselves is definitely left out on purpose, I think.
Yeah.
For majority of this passage.
The question is why? And I think it's because it's meant to be universally understood and not particular. But it could be for other reasons. Yeah.
Sure.
But this scattering thing, let's not forget how much this event mirrors what happens to the Israelites. They get into the land. They're kind of weak conglomeration of separate tribes. They have a very charismatic, powerful leader in Samuel that leads them to want a king, that then eventually leads to David. And David becomes the king, right? And one of the ways he wants to centralize his authority is by centralizing worship in his capital city. So he builds a temple. That's very much what this tower image is. He wants God to dwell in his capital city. God blesses it. God says, okay. David's different than these guys. He asked permission. Kind of. He asked Nathan. And Nathan says, go ahead and do it. God's with you. You can do whatever you want. But then God comes to Nathan and says, you gave bad advice. I don't want David to do it. So then Nathan has to go back and eat crow. And he says to David, actually, God doesn't want you to build it. He wants your son to build it. But in any case, David does eventually build what their tower would have represented, would have been the temple for the Jewish people. And he does build it. And God does dwell with them. But because they continue living in sin, he eventually, this is the word, poots, he scatters them. He sends them into exile. And they go into Babylon, while the northern tribes are scattered by the Assyrians. And then the southern tribe of Judah goes into Babylon. So this history replays itself in the history of Israel. In fact, it replays itself in the history of most nations. That eventually, we don't even know who, we were talking about this earlier. People like to say the Assyrians are probably the same as the Babylonians, more or less. But we don't know who the Assyrians really are, because they were so effectively scattered that we really don't have any access to that lineage anymore. So this story replays itself in the history of Israel, and I would argue replays itself in Acts. Because essentially what happens, and you can, I know I'm doing a lot of talking here, but I'll give you a chance to respond to this kind of trajectory. In Acts, the Holy Spirit is poured out at Pentecost and everybody understands. So they have different languages, they have different cultures, but they understand each other's lips, right? They hear what Peter is saying in their own language. And it's a momentous moment. And the church begins there in Jerusalem, all these different nationalities. They're all Jewish to start with, but different nationalities. And they set up this home base in Jerusalem, and nobody wants to leave. They start selling everything. Like they're going to set up camp in Jerusalem. Then they get scattered. And that's when the gospel spreads, through persecution. The Greek-speaking Jews get persecuted. Because they get persecuted, they start going home. And Philip is one of them. He goes to the Samaritans. He goes to the Ethiopian eunuch. Stephen is, of course, one of them. He's the one who starts the persecution because him and his big mouth starts it. And then Paul and Barnabas are sent out into the diaspora, into the exile, to spread the message of the gospel. So even in Acts, this gets replayed. Scattering is seen as judgment, but it's actually mercy.
Right, yeah. A lot of, actually, I think that we focused on in my class about like what's going on here. And you talked about like the people here were trying to make a correction from the flood, and that they wanted to maybe do something better, which I think that they definitely knew they were doing something wrong or risky, but they probably, I don't know if they completely knew that they were doing something like definitely that God definitely didn't want them to do. But where was I? So as far as the scattering.
Yeah, so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city, which is probably where people get the idea it was half completed.
Right. And then I was talking about the corrective measure. So like God is doing a corrective measure here instead of the outright harsh judgment. Like you're saying, people think of scattering as the judgment, but the scattering is really like a kind hand leading them on a path that will allow them to be able to listen to God and obey him and follow him. Whereas clearly these people are just ignoring God. And I think what God is worried about is that, like we're talking about, the people are just going to keep doing what they're doing. They're going to completely forsake God, and people won't have the option really to do otherwise. Because like we're talking about, the one train of thought, there wasn't the individualism. They didn't have freedom of speech.
No, definitely not.
Freedom of religion ideas back then. So if the ruling people all agreed one thing and they're clearly not following God, then there's no place for God's people on earth. Right. So he scatters them. They stop building the city so that they can have that opportunity, and maybe they'll realize, well, the thing that we feared happened. So like, what does this mean?
But God is going to do what they did here in Israel, but he wants to do it with someone who knows him. Right. And that's the choice of Abraham. God's going to introduce himself.
It seems like the real problem is not that they built a city. It's not even that they settled. It's just that they weren't with God.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you on that. And then we hit that point you've been alluding to all through, where we finally find out who these people are. Right? This is verse 9. Yeah. Therefore, it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there, the earth scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. And then we're going to get into another list of descendants, which we can do momentarily. But now we find out the name of the city.
Right. Yeah. So we have Babel here, which is, we use in the English, we have Babel here because it's similar to like babbled, like confused. The Lord confused the language. But Babel here is the same as where Babylon is used and all the rest of the places in the Bible.
Right. We have the English word Babel because of this word. Yeah.
That makes sense. But the word is just like confused, Babel.
Yeah, and the same letter in Hebrew, bait, can be pronounced as a hard B or as a V, depending on where it is in, technically, whether it's the beginning of a syllable or the close.
So it's a perfect play for English here.
Right. But it is the same letter, B or V. So Babel is the way that you would transliterate it. But yes, you would pronounce it Babel. Yeah, with more of a V sound. But yeah, there's some debate over this word, in fact, but it looks like it means confused.
Well, he certainly does confuse people.
Because the word confused is a different root. It's bait, lamed is Balel. But anyway, it's probably related in an ancient language, like before Hebrew. Or Aramaic, depending on who you're arguing with. But yeah, and he confuses again the lips of all the earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad. So their project is incomplete. But I'm not sure the city is. Like right. That's the way that I read it.
Right, like it's easy because like we're seeing it had built, and you look to the Hebrew, and it's a perfect completed thing. And then here they're left off building the city. But in the same way, any city that we have today is never finished. I mean, right. You drive around, they're doing construction all over the place.
Yeah.
I mean, Syracuse has been built for a long time.
Yeah, you have to maintain a city, and then there's what is the ethos of the city? Why has it been built? And that project goes on until it's completed, and that clearly was not completed. They had not taken over all the earth.
So yeah, the ideals that they were building and the culture that they had created was left off. What they were trying to do. And
do you think God is always against this kind of nation building that they seem to be involved in?
Like a people that are of one mind and
one lip and one way of thinking, one set of words.
That's a good question. Like I was saying, I don't think these people were specifically targeted because of that.
Yeah.
I think they were targeted because that one lip was not with God.
Right. Which is true of just about every nation that's ever been founded, except maybe the exception of Israel. And certainly we are Jesus is meant to establish a kingdom with one lip and one devar. It's meant to be the devar of God, the logos of God, right, would be the New Testament way of saying it in Greek, the logos of God. But in the Old Testament would be the devar of God, one devar. Jesus said that he never said anything the Father hadn't said, and he never did anything the Father hadn't done. And the same impetus is given to us with Jesus. So it does seem to me that this impulse is the right impulse. I think that's why I'm sympathetic to them. That's why I tend to think that they were trying to do the right thing, but they're doing it in the wrong way. And I think that's the big problem. And I think you've done a great job identifying in what way they're wrong. God is nowhere to be found in their plans. Right? This is, and I mean, but God is here somewhere. They don't ask him if this is where he wants them to settle. They don't ask him if this is the right goal. But they do build a tower for him. So it's not like they don't want him there. But they want him there for their own reasons. And there is a difference. And you might say that's the difference with David. Why does David want God in Jerusalem? Now, if he's following in the spirit of these builders, he wants him in Jerusalem to validate that city. But that doesn't seem to be David's heart. David, well, maybe it is David's. I mean, who knows? David's brothers thought he was a glory hound. That's what they accuse him of. And you could see his behavior could be read that way. But because we're told he's a man after God's own heart, I like to think that David wanted God in Jerusalem because David wanted to be close to him. There was a relationship that he wanted, and he wanted the people to have to come to Jerusalem. And that's a generous reading of David. You could also say that David, just like these builders, just simply wants the validation of God. He wants the power centralized, and that's why he wants the ark. And I mean, I don't want to push you into David. You weren't probably ready to criticize the greatest king in the history of Israel. But I see this very similar, building this tower. They wanted God there. And I find a lot, even contemporary people want God in their lives. The question is why?
Right. I guess what I would maybe nuance when people want God in their life, they want like a God in their life, the God of their choosing, a God that they already maybe agree with.
But they may be convinced at the same time that that's the real God.
Right. It's possible.
That's a scary part of us, right? Humans tend to think that the God we want is God. Like that
we generally do, but throughout the Bible, we see the Israelite people constantly turning to other gods that are clearly not the right God. And God calls them out pretty harshly every time and says, he doesn't give them a ton of slack. I mean, he forgives people, but he never tells them, oh, you were close. Like, you really were trying to follow me, but you weren't. It's usually like, you completely forsook me.
Yeah, the saddest, and I tend to want to read Babel sympathetically, I think, because the saddest people that I meet are people that are absolutely convinced that they are making their decisions as God would have them make them. And then when you look at the scriptures, or you realize they don't have a chance of doing that they're not doing the right thing at all. But it's not that they intend to do the wrong thing. You just meet a lot of people like that, very, very earnestly believe they're doing the right thing. Like Paul. Paul was persecuting the church, and he believed that to be the right thing to do until he met Jesus. I tend to read this project in that way. There's no way that biblically they could have known they were doing the wrong thing in advance. That seems to me to be a theme. I guess that's why I want to read it here, because like with Cain, God had never given them any instructions about sacrifices. So Cain could not have known in advance that his sacrifice would have been inadequate. And yet it was inadequate, I think, because of his heart. But he didn't know God was aiming at the heart. This is the thing. You get caught unaware. And I think God corrects that. I think after Babel, he chooses Abraham and he decides he's going to clearly reveal his will through one family so that this guessing can end. That's the way I tend to read these stories going. But I mean, as you know, some of that's conjecture.
Yeah, I like that idea that they maybe were aiming for the right thing, but were off the mark. I guess like to me, the things like they're trying to make a name for themselves and like worrying about being scattered, that stands out as something that seems like they knew. To me, it would think that that's something they shouldn't be trying to do.
Yeah.
But I agree that they don't have a lot of instruction and or direction at this point. So they don't really know what is acceptable. And I think these people would definitely have known less what God wanted from them than we would know today.
Yeah, and that phrase name, you're right. I mean, there's a lot of ego, a lot of pride bound up in that. But because the idea of a person's name is what they stand for. So like when Jesus says, anything you ask in my name, he doesn't mean, I think it's very clear, he doesn't mean that his name is now a magical term, that you just have to utter it and you get whatever you want. The sense is there, and we see it more clearly expressed in other places as the apostles have to make this clear to people. He's talking about, you ask according to my ethics, my values, who I am. That's what your name is. It's who you are. In the First Testament, they would give people names that evidence their character. So we talked about this right in chapter 10, Peleg. Name means divided, because in his day the earth was divided, right? His name fits something. And I think that's what they're looking for, that whatever their common lip and their common devar is, they want it preserved. They want to make a name for themselves. They want their ethics, their ethos, their values, whatever, to be preserved. They think of it as important. My kids and I just watched, we just finished watching Avatar series, that cartoon. Did you ever watch that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the first one, Last Airbender series. And in that world, the Fire Nation attacks all the other nations. And as you progress through it, you find out why later on in the series, right? And the Fire Lord thinks, we're living a time of prosperity. We have such great peace. We have such great ideas. We're just pretty much the smartest people on earth. We would do the world a favor by conquering them. And it's a wonderfully written series, because I think that's somewhat what's at stake here. I think that's what they mean by making a name for themselves. They think there's something about themselves worth preserving. And you're not going to preserve yourself if you can't keep yourself distinct. And that's what they essentially want to do. Well, God wants the same thing, but about himself. So the instinct itself is not inherently evil. They think they have something worth preserving.
Right.
But I think that's the idea of name. And when we say God's great name, we sing these worship songs about how great his name is. What we mean is how great his way is, how great his law is, how great his teachings are, how great his character is, how great, that's what's bound up in a name. And,
right. These people think that their name, their character, their ways are what's best, but they forget to include God. So that's their major mistake here.
I hate to say this, but I've been a Babylonian in this way in the past. I remember arguing with a friend of mine who didn't think it was worth having children because he thought the world was a terrible place. And I remember saying to him, And he said it made an impact on him. I said, I think Jennifer and I have something worth preserving. And you preserve who you are through your children. And I said, I think there's something we have that's worth preserving. I realize now that was a wicked impulse to think of it that way. You know, God says he wanted his people to have children because he wanted godly children. Like, the reason to have children is to keep the knowledge of God in the world, not to keep our own unique history in the world. And it's only now that I realize, you know, so many years later, how sinful and how Babylonian that mentality really was. And it affected how I raised my kids early on, because I wanted to teach them how to be Johnsons. Christian Johnsons, but Johnsons. And I realized that's what the Babylonians are doing. You know, they want God in there, but they want to preserve something unique to them.
Yeah.
And I realize now what I should have said to my friend is, the knowledge of God should be preserved in the world. It's been entrusted to us. The least we can do is raise a generation that remembers. But I was so self-centered at the time. In my late 20s, I didn't see it. Don't tell my kids.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you have been remembering to raise your kids, fear of the Lord.
Yeah.
So,
but
regardless of whether you originally wanted to have them be raised as Johnsons.
Yeah. Or, you know, I was raised to be an American Christian. You know, and then I wanted to raise my kids as Johnson Christians. You know, Johnson Nazarene Christians. You know,
perfect,
but it's
right?
all the same thing. That's my point. It's all the same thing.
Yeah.
There's something unique. We've got something right. We got to make sure it's not lost.
Yeah, that is a very human, but also kind of like, I don't know, like every culture feels that they have something like that is unique and that needs to be preserved. And kind of like we were talking about, you asked, like, is it wrong for any nation to be like this? And immediately I was thinking of like God's kingdom, but that's not the same as here. So like the thing that we all really should be trying to preserve and the thing we should be focusing on is God. And like we were talking about at Pentecost, like experiencing God in his fullness and things like that. That would be where we should be focusing. That's where the name we want to make. But
it's God's name we should want to preserve in the earth, not our own. And,
to be concise over the last 20 minutes.
Yeah. Well, you said you
try to preserve God's name over our own.
Yeah. But the thing is, we can conflate the two. And that's where the issue comes in, right? Because I mean, denominations like Church of Nazarene that we're a part of, we do believe by preserving, I think our instinct is to believe that by preserving Nazarene teaching, we are preserving the knowledge of God. We believe that we have something significant that shouldn't be lost, that maybe others don't have. And we associate it with God. But I think Babel should be a warning to all of us that we shouldn't conflate our uniqueness or ambitions with God. That God might come down and see what we're doing. They're doing it. They built a ziggurat for him, man. They wanted him there, but he didn't like what they had built. We have to always be ready for that. And Jesus pretty much comes to say, he pretty much comes to the Israelites and to the Romans precisely as God came down to the people building Babel. He looks at the whole thing and he says, nah.
Yeah, you got it all wrong. You did all of this without me again.
Yeah. and this time you had my word. You still did it without me.
I know. You knew better, but you.
Yeah. And one of the deepest questions I have, and I don't know that I'll have the courage to ask him if I ever had opportunity in the new heavens and the new earth, is why he waits so long to choose a people and then give them the law. And I've heard many people say, well, maybe we just don't know the story of when he did that in the past. And that's true, but that's like arguing between the lines. For some reason, the way this history is preserved for us and the way God wants us to remember it is that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which covers an impossible to estimate period of history, that it's done mostly without God. And the ultimate result of it is the devastation of the flood. And then people returning to some pretty poor decision making fairly early on. So why God wants us to remember the history that way? I'm not saying that other things couldn't have happened. Maybe God did give them law. Maybe he chose one of these nations. We just don't have access to any of that. All we have is the way he's given it to us. And for some reason, he waits until Abraham to initiate this personal walk.
Yeah.
And that's one of my questions. Did he really wait that long? And if he did, why? Like that's just a question. I remember listening to an atheist, Christopher Hitchens, argue about, he liked to try and present Christianity in its most unflattering light. And he assumed the historical reconstructions of secular historians were accurate. So in the secular historical history, humans have been on the earth about 100,000 years, give or take. And they start as a small population in East Africa. And Hitchens famously, I think he said this in many debates, would say, God only interacts with Abraham a few thousand years ago, say 5,000 years ago. But humans have been on the planet for 100,000 years. How do you account for the other 95,000 years? Did God just, humans weren't interesting to him? So that was the way Hitchens did it. Now, of course, as Christians, we're not sure about any of those historical reconstructions. But it still begs the same, he was asking the same question I asked. You know, right. Why does it take so long?
Yeah, when you look at it, like, as you just described, like, if you were to look at it a 100,000 year block, and you think, I mean, and we think God is patient now. Imagine how patient he has been.
Yeah.
But I guess my first thought when you were originally bring up that question is, like, we believe and think that God knows what's going on all the time, omnipotent and everything. But he would know that the people would need the story through Abraham. Yeah. But I think what's important maybe in the first 11 chapters is to show that God let us do what we wanted without much guidance. And this is how it turned out. I mean, he's like, I give you a chance. I had to have the flood. I had to scatter people. People are getting killed. You have to put a mark on Cain. Like, you've done things without me. And this is how it turns out. Nothing good comes from this. So this is what's next. You have to.
I think you're right that that's why he wants us to remember the history in this way. But there may be a deeper story. Because funny enough, even with the intervention that we know is part of our history, we still are doing everything on our own. Our nation building is still on our own, even though Israel's in the world, even though the law has been given. So maybe there is a story like that in the ancient world. We just don't know. I keep insisting that this is how God wants us to remember the history. You know, this is the best way to remember it. And Abraham's family ends up coming from this plain of Shinar in the story. So his family is not scattered. They remain pretty much where this city was built. He seems to be part of the Sumerian Empire, which capital is in this region. And he comes from the city of Ur, which is one of Sumeria's capitals, as far as we know. So Abraham's family stays here. And it is from this group that God chooses one. And that one is Abraham.
Right. We didn't talk a ton about the actual scattering, like how that plays out.
Yeah. Do you have any last insights on that?
Yeah, I think that, like, because he confuses the language is what causes the scattering. I think a lot of people maybe imagine that God literally, like, and physically scatters people all over. But I think the idea of what's happening here is the language, or their ideologies, but was all combined because of the language.
Yeah.
That allowed them to do the things they were doing. And once they weren't able to communicate anymore, they couldn't understand each other. Then they separated, because what are you going to do? Live with a bunch of people that you can't even understand? So and from there, like in that language that it says, from there the Lord scattered them.
Yeah.
So because they couldn't understand each other, they all left. And I think Abraham could have been, or his family could have been, one of the ones that was scattered away from Babel or wherever the place exactly was where they were. I mean, Ur isn't very far from where they think the city would have been if you were looking at a map.
Right.
We don't know exactly where these things were, but or where people think they were. I mean, it's within a distance that he could have I mean, I don't know how long, but he could have gotten there, and that's where he could have eventually scattered from, and those were the people that he did understand. And that's what caused people to scatter all across.
And as we've been saying, you could take this very naturally as simple languages, but the repetition seems to indicate that it's more than just talking the same. They're also thinking the same. So when he scrambles there, he might, I mean, it might have changed their actual language. It might have. But it just as equally could be that he simply caused them to think differently from each other, that their purposes became crossed. You could argue right now in the United States of America, our languages are being scrambled. I mean, we all speak English, but we're no longer speaking the same English. We're saying the same things, but we don't hear the same things. And in order for a country to stay together, you have to have a shared history and a shared interpretation of that history and a shared understanding of who you are and where you're going. That's the only way for nations to stay together. And right now, all the things that would normally unify a nation are at odds with each other. We're reinterpreting our history. We are fractured at the moment, and nobody agrees on where we're going. This, we could be seeing played out in real time what Genesis is trying to describe. So this is the right way to remember it. And if somebody were to remember this period of American history, depending on how it ends up playing out, they might say the languages were scrambled and we were scattered if the nation breaks up. If the nation doesn't, there'd be another way of describing it. But we could be living out a lived out parable, a lived out version of what is being described. So it's important to recognize how vague the language is, and yet how important that vagueness is, because it applies to lots of situations. What's interesting, though, in Babel is it's God who scrambles it all. We tend to think God wants to unify people, and Satan wants to scatter them. But in the scriptures, it's more frequent that Satan unifies and God scatters, unless we're unifying around Jesus.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely, there is a sense of that for sure, that it seems like you'd expect, quote unquote, God to be the one that does the unifying and combining. But a lot of people in the Bible are called out of, like, that. All their stories start as like they were called out of. Even Abraham, his story starts leaving where he was. He's like separated and scattered from his family even right after this other scattering that he probably or could have been a part of as well.
Yeah. Following God is often to be called away. That's often even with pastoral ministry, which you're being called into and I was called into. I tell you, if you talk to my mother about pastoral ministry, she'd be able to talk to you about the challenges, the blessings, all that stuff. But there's one part that has broken her heart and she can't forget. And she brings it up all the time. And it's the fact that I no longer live near them. And I never have since I followed the call. That is very, very consistent for those who follow God, that they're called away. God more frequently scatters. He's the sower, scattering the seed, the salt, scattering the salt, sending the people of Israel into exile, sending the church into exile. That's the language of 1 Peter. Right? That tends to be what God does. But people tend to want to settle. Like you said, you pointed out that word. We like to stay in one place. Just like the early church wanted to do that in Jerusalem. They wanted everybody to come to them. And that's what we all want. But God has a way of making sure the salt doesn't stay in the salt shaker.
Yeah. I guess it's another like selfish ambition that we need to remember to focus ourselves toward, or orient ourselves towards God on, is thinking like convincing ourselves maybe that we're like in the wrong way of thinking again. Like we should be trying to settle down and do this in this one spot, or this is where we need to be, but maybe that's not.
Yeah. If God calls you to settle, praise his name. Because he said that, right, in Jeremiah to the exiles, settle down in Babylon, you're going to be there a while. That's, plant vineyards, have your children get married, raise children. It's great when God tells you to settle. But when God's really moving, it's generally upsetting.
Right. Chances are it's calling you to scatter.
So you mentioned the tendency people have to see the scattering as very deliberate, that God is specifically putting people in places. I think and I think you were disagreeing with that, but maybe not. I just know you mentioned it. And when you did, it reminds me of Acts. And this might be where people get the idea. In Acts 17, verse 26, Paul says this. He's speaking in Athens at this time. He's on the Areopagus. And he's speaking to the philosophers of Athens. And he says, from one ancestor, God made all nations to inhabit the whole earth. And he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he's not far from each of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said. So the sense for Paul, as he's interpreting the dissemination of the nations across the earth, it sounds like Paul understands that this fracturing of humanity was for the purpose of making them pursue God. And you would think that would be better done together, but apparently that's not right. That's better done, I guess, scattered. And you can see how the way Paul puts it, that God is demarcating exactly the places where people should go. You can understand why some would read that in a very sovereignty-heavy way. Right.
Yeah, it's easy to, like you're saying, you'd think it's like, oh, I want to surround myself with other Christians. I want to surround myself with people that are already thinking the same way. And if we hunker down together, we can figure this all out.
Yeah. Never seems to work, though.
An idol maybe that we have is that we try to maybe rely too much on other people, other Christians even, in some ways, instead of actually relying on God.
Yeah, we're always trying to build a city. Always trying to build a city, a central location. You can call it a denomination, you can call it a nation, you can call it a town. We're always trying to build something that will preserve our name in the world. I love this story because it plays out in so many different ways throughout the scriptures. And that's the thing about these first 11 chapters of Genesis. And what I would want to wrap up with is just the realization that these stories tell the whole story of human history over and over and over again. That what we see from creation to Babel, because Babel's really the end of this opening cosmic section as we particularize to Abraham, this becomes the road humanity travels over and over and over again. We never get off this road unless God calls us out, like he did Abraham. But apart from that, we're going to follow the road from Eden to the flood to Babel every time. And so I find it, if it's not inspired, it is the most genius work of literature imaginable, because it not only summarizes what's come before, but predicts what will come next. And of course, I do believe it's inspired, so I'm not surprised it's this ingenious, but it is ingenious. And you don't have to be a particularly strong believer to see it. You might be aware of this, Lucas, and maybe some of our people are, but Jordan Peterson is a PhD in psychiatry or psychology and taught at the University of Toronto and hit national fame for standing up for free speech in Canada some years ago. And in about a year's time became one of the foremost speakers, intellectuals, public intellectuals in the world. Traveled the whole globe, sold out auditoriums. It got sick. His wife got sick, and then he had some problems, and he's disappeared from the world scene. But during his meteoric rise, it became people became aware that he had done a psychological study of the book of Genesis, and he focused specifically. He went through the whole book, but he really camped in the first 11 chapters. and he's not like he's a non-Christian, like he's kind of Canadian, has religious upbringing in a sense, but was not a church attender or would not call himself a believer. And yet he continued to he argued that the story of Cain and Abel is the most sophisticated story ever told, and that it's bottomless what you can get from it, and it's only a few sentences long. He marvels at it, and he does a whole lecture series. You can find it on YouTube. Whole lecture series through Genesis. Unbelievable what he finds there. And that's I don't go to it quite psychologically the way that he does, but it's astounding how much is bound up. I think we've, in our conversation today, we've just shown how much there really is there. You and I barely scratch the surface. You could dig down any one of these things we've suggested, and it's almost bottomless how far you could go. Think about the dissertation that could be written comparing the building of the temple in Jerusalem to the building of the tower in Babel. It's endless. And it has contemporary manifestation too. Our founding fathers, why did they build? Why did they want to establish this nation? On what tenets was it based? So on and so forth. Over and over again. So I don't know if you have any closing words. I'm giving you a chance if you do.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up briefly like what these people's goals were. My class was focusing on exegesis, so mostly on what is in and behind the text more so than how do you actually interpret the text. Yeah.
For the lay folks out there, the technical terms are exegesis, which is discovering what's there, and hermeneutics, interpreting it.
Right. And then, so after an entire semester of studying what is there, we did one very small theological reflection, which my topic essentially was about our goals. But I guess I do think that is where these people are going wrong, and what we could maybe learn and focus on from this passage. Their goals were just not aligned with God.
Yeah.
And kind of like what we've been talking about, like what are our goals? Are we focusing on things that are like close, like you were suggesting, like they were trying something that they thought was right, but it was just off the mark? Like, are our goals close, but a little bit off? Maybe are our goals really far off?
Yeah. Are you grateful? I am so grateful that God is more interested in what's in our hearts than in what we do with our hands. Now, I mean, what we do with our hands reflects what's in our hearts, but there's a lot of grace for people who inadvertently step out of God's will. Less grace for those who the Bible calls them the raised right hand, people who do it defiantly, much less grace for them. But I do think that scattering these folks was a mercy. It was a mercy. He stopped them before their project got beyond the point that there was no turning back, which had happened in the flood. Yeah, so it's mercy that he does this. Yeah, we don't always receive it as mercy. I doubt the people there who had their whole project upended would have seen it as a very merciful act. But from a cosmic perspective, we see that it was merciful. And whenever God breaks up a nation, the nation will see that as judgment. And in some ways it is, but it's a mercy at the same time. Because God does not break up things that are going well.
Right, yeah. I mean, if it was meant to be, if it was something that was from God, then it wouldn't get broken down.
It wouldn't break up. But you know a tree by its fruit. So
that's maybe something that we could think about when things maybe seem to be falling apart.
That's right. Yeah,
is any of this something that maybe God is actually planning? Because it seems terrible, but we were on the wrong path before.
Yeah, it's tricky to know which side of God you're on, because if you're on the side of God where something's being torn down that he doesn't want torn down, then of course you want to defend it. But if he's the one tearing it down, then you want to let it happen. And which side of history are you on? Well, we don't often know. And right. I don't think these people knew until the project fell apart, which side they were on. And maybe they didn't even know then, but Abraham eventually was told. Right. Paul didn't know which side of God he was on. He thought he was fighting for God when he was persecuting the church. He believed it. He was zealous. but he was zealously fighting against God. And I think the most shocking moment in Paul's life had to have been on the road to Damascus when Jesus said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he says, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm Jesus." And then his whole, "What? You're real?" Like, I thought this was a bunch of hogwash. What do you mean, Jesus? And then Paul's whole life flashes before his eyes, like, wow, I've been on the wrong side of the whole thing. He never really forgives himself for it. He keeps calling himself the chief of sinners. He almost deliberately makes himself suffer. But he doesn't think he can ever make up for his sin. He's so glad for forgiveness. But he still carries, you can see it in Corinthians, Galatians, he carries it with him. So we don't know which side of God we're on. And maybe we can learn from the folks who built Babel that you should ask him and not just assume you know.
Right.
When something's falling down, maybe we should ask God whether he wants it down. But oftentimes we're so sure which side God is on, we don't even ask.
Yeah. And that returns to the whole idea that besides that the scattering was good for them, they neglected to ask God anything. They're just doing whatever they want, irrelevant. And then again, when God scatters, I'm sure they were like, "This is terrible. How could we stop this?"
Yeah. I mean, the children's version of this is that they were speaking English because, everybody knows English is the original language. You saw that was sarcastic, right? People watching, that was sarcastic. But they were all speaking English, and then suddenly somebody started speaking French. That's the kind of the children's version. That is how it's presented to us, because that's easy for everybody to understand. But I like to think that what's beneath it is a change of perspective. Like they were building this tower, and somebody said, "Why are we using bricks? I think we should find some better material." And somebody said, "What do you mean? We already got all these plans. We got all these bricks. We're not going to use these bricks." And then they just start fighting. So that's the way I imagine, because in my home, in my family, that's how the language is. We all speak English, but we can hardly agree on any two things. You can speak the same language and still be confused.
I think that's a fair simplification of what's happening here.
Yeah, again, and I said this, you and I talked about this. These stories seem to me highly summarized versions of history that are presented in a way that we can understand what really happened. But they're not, like I've been saying throughout, dragnet versions of history where if we were there to film it, first of all, it probably would have taken a lot longer, and it probably would be way more complicated. But God has summarized the history, presented it to us in a way that we will understand what essentially happened, and we live out of these stories as history. This is history as God has given it to us. I'm sure it was more complicated, but this is good enough. This is the best possible way to remember it. This
is what's important. This is what most needs to be remembered.
Yeah. Summarized history. All history is summary. Nobody has ever. I often give people, when I used to teach Hebrew, I would teach exegesis at the same time, because it's hard to teach a language without teaching how to plumb the depths. And so I would give some students who seemed to really have struggled. Some students really struggle with the idea that God would summarize history. And I would give them the assignment of going home and writing out 1 hour of conversing over the dinner table and see how long it took to every word. Record it and then transcribe it and see how many words. And you realize how impossible it is to be exhaustive. I mean, the story of Cain and Abel is told in just a few sentences. But if you were to film it, it would take you forever. The script you would have to write would be pages and pages long. So all history is summary. People pick out the parts of history they think best tell the story they're trying to tell. So if you're going to tell the story of the Holocaust, you're going to pick out events that you think lead to that, illuminate that, explain it in some way. And you're going to have to leave out a lot. Same thing with the first 11 chapters. What has been preserved for us is, you can't even calculate how small a percentage of the actual history it would be. But this is exactly the right way to remember it. This is the perfect summary of the events of prehistory. That's how I read it.
I would agree. And like you're saying, the summary like keeps continuing to play over, so we see the same mistakes going over and over again.
There's nothing new under the sun. What has been before. What will be, right? So what is has been before. What will be has already occurred. There's nothing new under the sun, right? That's Ecclesiastes.
Yeah.
That's literally true. Put in a figurative way.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's metaphor, but it's almost literal.
We've had before. We continue to have.
Yeah. And so whatever happened here, you and I talked about this at the beginning. We didn't get into it in this discussion, but is this global or is this just one people group? That doesn't matter, because what's represented here is true everywhere. So one people group can easily represent everybody, because we're all the same in this way. Not only the same back then, the same now. This is why the Romans built Rome. It's why the Babylonians built Babel. It's why the Israelites built Jerusalem. It's why we built Washington, D.C. Like, so it's everybody, even if it's only one.
I guess the gravest mistake we could make is thinking, well, that we don't make the same mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly we can read it here. So why would we do the same thing that they do?
Yeah.
There's these stupid people that are.
Right. Man, if I was there, I would have spoken up. Yeah.
Right.
I'm sure we all would. We don't know to speak up, because when everybody has one lip and one devar, one mouth and the same words, nobody sees the error. And so God has to pull a prophet out. That's what happens with Elijah. It's what happened with Ezekiel. He's got to pull somebody out of that mess and then tell the people what they should be seeing. And that's what Abraham was to the Sumerians. It's what, Samuel was to the judges. It's what Elijah was to the northern kingdom. It's what Isaiah was to the south. You got to pull somebody out of that, because the groupthink is absolute. When you're in it, you can't see the error. Well, thank you, Lucas. We'll close this one out, and I'll be back next week with Minister Joe as we kind of cross into new territory as we deal with the story of Abraham. So